Welcome back, dear viewers. You're still watching The Breakfast Show on Nile TV International. It's now time for a second and final topic of discussion for today, and we're going to be talking about ancient Egypt's 29th and 30th dynasties. And to shed more light on this topic, we're most delighted to be joined here in the studio by Mr. Ihab Kamel, and he's a researcher and historian. First of all, good morning, sir, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Ihab, and of course today we'll be focusing on the 29th and 30th dynasty. So how do you see these two dynasties? I think these were the last two dynasties. And
Exactly.
Would you tell us who divided the pharaonic history to these 30 dynasties?
Well, this division is a very ancient division that dates back to the Ptolemaic period, when a priest, his name was Manitou, had written the ancient Egyptian history, and he had divided the ancient pharaohs into dynasties. So actually, since it's a very ancient source, so we still are committed to his division, which was to a great extent confirmed by the latest archaeological discoveries. So, and especially that we had also discovered what we know as king's lists, either on papyri or on stone slabs or buildings like the one in Abydos, like the famous Palermo stone, which is in Italy, and other papyri which are scattered all around the world museums that are following the same division.
Right. How did the rule of the 29th dynasty begin?
Well, actually, as we said before, that Egypt was under the Persian occupation. These were, you can call it, the last days of Egypt as an independent country. So Egypt had fallen under Persian occupation, and at that time the world had actually changed. There was a different conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, who were two big superpowers, and Egypt was involved as the third pillar that had formed the international politics at that time. But actually Egypt was not as strong as it used to be, so it ended up during the time of King Darius being occupied, forming the 27th dynasty. That was a Persian dynasty. So Darius declared himself as a pharaoh. As a matter of fact, as Egypt was a Persian province, this did not mean that the Egyptians had surrendered to the Persian occupation, and they had fought, and they had so many revolutions until one of their local princes, his name was Amun-Her, had succeeded around the year 404 BC in liberating Egypt from the Persian occupation. This was the appearance of a new Egyptian dynasty that was known as the 29th dynasty, that had started by a king. His name was Nef-Aurud I. And at that time there was a strong alliance between Egypt and Greece. Of course, and especially Athens, if I may say so. At that time, Egypt and Greece became very close, or Athens, the kingdom of Athens, or the state of Athens, and there was like an alliance against the Persians. Of course, the Persians were the Greeks' greatest enemy, and for the Egyptians as well, they occupied their country for decades. So, especially that also since the 26th dynasty, and Egypt had very strong relationship with the Greeks. They started employing them to work as mercenaries. The Greeks had made a Greek polis called Nocrates in Egypt, and it became a center for trade between Egypt and Greece. So the bonds and ties were very strong. Anyhow, this had led to an alliance between Egypt and Athens, and that's when this king, the founder of the 29th dynasty, had continued what his ancestor Amun-Her had started, and they had started fighting the Persians in order to protect the Egyptian throne.
What are the most important monuments or relics that dates back to this era?
Unfortunately, very little. You have to understand that this these two dynasties, their capitals were in a place called Mendes in the delta. Mendes nowadays, it's occupied by two cities near Simbalawain. One is called Tumayl Amdid and Tal al-Rabah. This is in the middle of an agricultural area, so by nature, if there's anything, the water of agriculture and the wet weather will not leave much. Besides that, Egypt at that time was in a state of war against the Greeks, against the Persians, and of course that was reflected on the monuments that were left. But in the 30th dynasty, actually, because there was a kind of stability for almost 13 years during the time of their king Nekhit-Herheb, or Nektanebbu as the Greeks call him, around the year 360 BC, he left us lots of monuments inside the Egyptian temples, like the Karnak, like Luxor temple, like Philae, like on the island of Philae, and left us lots of statues of a very high quality, which are scattered all over the world and in the Egyptian museum as well, which indicates that despite that Egypt was not in its best shape, and yet the Egyptian art, architecture, as well as science and knowledge were still by far ahead from the rest of the world. You can say that the Greeks considered themselves to be the most intellectual, the most advanced intellectually worldwide, but yet when it came to art and when it came to science, they used to take their knowledge from the Egyptians. Still, Egypt was the main non-exhaustible resource.
Mr. Ihab, also about the end of this dynasty. How did it come to an end, the 29th?
Unfortunately, it ended up with a coup. That the last king of this dynasty, King Nf Awrud II, actually he lost it with a coup, and we found a new pharaoh. Apparently he was one of the local princes who led that coup, and his name was Nekhitneb, or as the Greeks called him, Nektanebbu II, and this was around 380 BC. And probably this was one of the reasons why that had weakened Egypt a lot and exhausted the country's resources. And yet this king, he also kept the alliance with the Athenians, who at that time you can say they had started having second thoughts whether if it's worth it to be enemies for a huge empire like the Persians and keep their alliance with the Egyptians or not. And that what had encouraged the Persians at that time, during the time of their king Artaxerxes III, to try to invade Egypt, but King Nekhit-Herheb defeated him. They left the Persians until they got near Memphis, and they kept retreating until the flood season, which was a very brilliant idea at that time. And then they attacked them after the Persians became besieged. But this kept the peace for a very short while, only like 13 years, and later on he was followed by his son Nekhitneb II, or Nektanebbu II, and he enjoyed also that period of peace, but it was a false peace, because he did not know that the Persians did not attack Egypt because simply they had internal problems in Persia. But you can say that the Greeks at that time, or the Athenians, they were turning more like mercenaries. They sell their effort to whoever pays more. So obviously the Persians had contacts with them, and they succeeded in buying them at that time. And it's very famous, the story of the mercenaries leader, the Athenian Chabrias, and that in the middle of the battle he had left the Egyptian army, and it seems to be that the problems were reaching the big ally of Egypt, Athens, and at the same time there was a strong superpower appearing in Greece, which was Macedonia, under the rule of King Philip the Macedonian, the father of Alexander the Great.
So that was the end of the 29th dynasty. Then how did the last dynasty start and rise to power?
As I said, by a coup that led that King Nectanebo I ascended the throne, and then he had to fight a big battle against the Persians with his allies, the Greeks and the King of Cyprus. But on his way to the battlefield, there was a coup inside Egypt that had led to the ascendance of his grandson, King Nectanebo II. And it seems to be that King Nectanebo I, he lived in Phoenicia as a refugee, which had encouraged King Artaxerxes III to attack Egypt. At that time, of course, as I said, Egypt was left alone with no ally, and the Persians had succeeded in avoiding the mistakes they made in the battle, the first battle they had lost, and they succeeded in entering Egypt, and King Nectanebo had to retreat to Memphis, the capital, but he was defeated again, and he had escaped, they say, to Nubia. It's not very clear where he went, and he had disappeared, and this was around the year 360 BC. Unfortunately, the Persians were the worst invaders Egypt had ever seen. They are the ones who were responsible for destroying most of the ancient Egyptian temples, robbing their treasures, and they ruled Egypt for 28 years until Alexander the Great came and he defeated them, and Egypt became a part of Alexander the Great's empire.
Also, Mr. Ihab, if you can highlight the important monuments during this reign.
Surprisingly, King Nectanebo II, despite of his disturbed period, it seems to be that the country at that time was back to the classic art. We had found lots of his statues. As I said, they are found all over the world. He had left us lots of monuments, small monuments inside the ancient temples. He did not build a big temple for himself, but he left us lots of monuments. He restored also lots of monuments that were destroyed by the Persian invaders. And amazingly, the Egyptians had considered him to be their great hero for a very long period because of his because of retrieving back the ancient Egyptian civilization, especially that the priest, he had given lots of land to the temples and lots of donations to the temples, and the temples had started retrieving back their wealth and their glory. And that's why they made him like a saint when he disappeared, to the extent that the Egyptians for a very long time, they thought that he was a saint and he disappeared and he will return back to save them from foreign occupation, which did not happen anyway, but his monuments and his statues indicates a very fine quality of art, very similar to the Old Kingdom art.
Right. After the 30th dynasty, did the Greco-Roman period start straight away?
Not straight away. As I said, Egypt was ruled for 20 years by the Persians. Then Egypt was invaded by Alexander the Great. Of course, the people were happy with Alexander the Great that he relieved them from the Persian occupation, because they understood that things will be the same. They knew the Greeks for a very long time, but it was very different. The Greeks being rulers from being allies. This was, yes, the beginning of the Greco-Roman period, the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, because Alexander did not stay for long in Egypt. After his death, his empire was divided among his generals, and Egypt became, around the year 300 BC, ruled by his general King Ptolemy I, who was known by the name of Soter. And this was the beginning of a new period, the Greco-Roman period.
Right, Mr. Ihab Kamel, Egyptologist and researcher, many thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you, sir. And dear viewers, by this we come to the end of this episode of the Breakfast Show. Just a quick recap. We talked about the Egyptian-Indian bilateral ties and historic relations, marking their 70th Independence Day, and also we went back in history to talk about the 29th and 30th dynasties in ancient Egypt. Dear viewers, you're in the company of myself, Karim Gaureddin, and Naveen Ramzi.
Thank you very much, Karim. Ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow with a new episode and a new crew.
مصر اللي من غيرها